I'm going to read a couple of quotes here. First one is from a Catholic monk named David Steindl-Rast. He says, "Unfortunately, over the course of the centuries, this, Christianity, has come to be presented in almost legal language, as if it were some sort of transaction, a deal with God. There was this gap between us and God. Somebody had to make up for it. All that business. We can drop that. The legal metaphor seems to have helped other generations. Fine, anything that helps is fine, but once it gets in the way, as it does today, we should drop it." I know, my sentiments exactly. Okay, Gareth. This is the Anglican Bishop of Vancouver, British Columbia. "The problem with exclusivism, and that means, there's only one way, is that it presents us with a God from whom we need to be delivered rather than the living God who is the hope of the world. The exclusivist God is narrow, rigid, and blind. This God pays no attention to the sanctity and personal holiness of people outside the Christian fold. This God takes no loving and parental pride in the lives of great spiritual teachers who spoke of other paths to truth. Figures like Moses, not true, not true. Buddha, Muhammad, and Gandhi. Such a God is not worthy of honor, glory, worship, or praise. This God offers no hope for a world deeply divided along religious lines, a world crying out for peace and reconciliation." Okay, this is known as interspirituality. And at the heart of interspirituality is a practice known as contemplative prayer. And that's what we're going to be looking at this morning. Alice Bailey, remember we talked about her, or I talked about her, over the course of the weekend. Okay, she, like I said, she was an English woman. She was from Manchester, and she moved to the U.S. and became acquainted with the Theosophical Society. And she became a New Age channeler and channeled a spirit guide over the course of a number of years, I think between 1919 and 1947. And she made some remarkable prophecies. Okay, she talked about an approaching universal religion. Bailey was under the firm conviction that the teaching from the East and of the West must be fused and blended before the true and universal religion for which the world waits could appear on earth. So she prophesied there was this coming universal world religion where the teaching of the East and the West would be blended. Now, from what I've found from my research, it only goes one way. It does not go both ways. The religions of the East are not fused and blended with the gospel, but the churches of the West, the religion of the West, is fused and blended with the teachings of the East. And that's what we're going to be looking at. That is happening. And this is a very recent phenomenon, very recent. This is not something you found earlier. And this is what she says. This is from her book, The Externalization of the Hierarchy. By the way, that 1976, it wasn't written then. That was just the edition. It was, she died in 1947, so this is something that she channeled before that. The Christian church, okay, get ready here, in its many branches, in other words, this wouldn't be just one denomination, it would be in its many branches, can serve as a St. John the Baptist, as a voice crying in the wilderness, and as a nucleus through which world illumination may be accomplished. And that term world illumination means, occultic illumination. In other words, the Christian church would serve as one would think, ladies and gentlemen, one would think that Christianity would stand against occultism, right? Would stand against this surge of what we've been talking about, things like Reiki and yoga. But what Alice Bailey was predicting is that the Christian church in its many branches, many denominations, would actually be a catalyst by which the New Age would come in. Alice Bailey should be, I'm sorry, it's good to have typos because it makes you humble. You want to be humble, It should read, Alice Bailey's prophecies can provide further insight into what the Apostle Paul called a falling away. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, in reference to the day of the Lord, that day shall not come except there come a falling away first, and then the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition. And that's at the end of this talk, but this was a good time to inject it. Bailey eagerly foretold of what she termed the regeneration of the churches. And we would see that as the apostasy of the churches, not the regeneration. What she meant by regeneration is that Christianity would be regenerated along occult lines. Okay, along with this, Alice Bailey talked about, boy, you get dried out pretty quick. She talked about someone known as the Coming One. And this seems to be a theme that runs through all New Age literature. This is from a book called Messiah and the Second Coming. The Coming One will not be Christian, a Hindu, a Buddhist, for he is for all humanity to unite all religions, philosophies, and nations. So the Coming One will not belong to any particular religion, but he will have a spirituality that can unite all the world's religions together into one entity. And we're going to look at what the catalyst is, what the actual practice is. How many of you here are ex-Catholics? Okay. You remember something called Vatican II? Yeah, Vatican II was a major change in the Catholic Church. Nuns started to dress a lot different, before they were, And you could eat meat on Friday. Before it was a mortal sin. And the Mass was said in Latin, and all of a sudden, it was changed into whatever the language of wherever you were at. And before, the priest had his back to the people, and after Vatican II, he faced the people. And I think there are probably other changes, but I can't remember them. But it was a major upheaval in the Catholic Church. This is Karl Rahner. He was called the brains of Vatican II, or the brains behind Vatican II. He was the major force behind it. And he said the Christian of the future will be a mystic, or he will not exist at all. In other words, in the future, all Christians will be mystics, or they won't be a Christian. That's the only type of Christian they'll be. That was the goal that he had in mind. Okay, this is a book called The Big Book of Christian Mysticism by Carl McColman. And the subtitle is The Essential Guide to Contemplative Spirituality. He says, in the future, all Christians will be mystics. We need to let go of the idea that some Christians are mystics while some are not. So what does that term contemplative mean? Well, that term kind of put me off for 10 years. I saw it clear back in 1984, 85, and I thought it had something to do with contemplating. Like you think deeply about things, you ponder them. Well, then I found out it has the opposite meaning. And this is what it means. This is from the book, The Big Book of Christian Mysticism. He explains it. The term contemplative comes from the Latin contemplare, which means in the temple. So what does that mean? Okay, it has the connotation of a professional mystic connecting with a deity in that deity's temple. In ancient Rome, they had gods and goddesses, and each god and goddess had a temple, like the temple of Jupiter, the temple of Isis, temple of Mars, etc., of Diana, etc., etc. And these individuals known as augurs, they were like soothsayers, they were like, what's that word, diviners, divination. They were practitioners of divination. And they would go into these temples and commune with the god of that temple. And that's what the word contemplare means. And it became secularized to mean, think deeply, but in the traditional religious sense, it means to commune mystically with a god. So when you hear the word contemplation, it has a mystical, explanation from that time period, the ancient world. So this is what it entails: listening beyond human thought. And this Rodney Romney was pastor of the First Baptist Church in Seattle, Washington. So this is a major church, a major U.S. city. He says, we cannot reach God through our minds. We can only reach God in absolute stillness when the mind has been transcended. God is only attained through that consciousness described as unknowing. And in the in the Catholic Church, there was a treatise called The Cloud of Unknowing. And that was basically that you use mantras, we'll get to that soon, to strike down all your thoughts. And that term unknowing means basically a trance. Okay, Christian TM, this is from a book called As Above, So Below. It was a New Age book, and it had all the various New Age paths. And one of them, of course, was Contemplative Christianity. And it says, those who have practiced transcendental meditation may be surprised to learn that Christianity has its own time-honored form of mantra meditation. Reliance on a mantric centering device had a long history in the mystical canon of Christianity. And by that, it means Roman Catholic mysticism. The monasteries and convents, were places where you would find this. It wasn't something for your typical peasant. It was more or less for a specialized elite. This is a book that became quite popular in the U.S., and it's called The Signature of Jesus. In other words, if you do this type of prayer, you'll have the signature of Jesus on your prayer life. And he says the first step in faith is to stop thinking about God at the time of prayer. Well, you might think, well, how can that be done? Well, that's mysticism. You don't think about God. You put yourself in a trance. So this may sound ridiculous to the type of people that pray to God like he's an individual, you actually talk to someone. But this type of prayer involves choose a single sacred word or phrase without moving your lips, repeat the sacred word inwardly, slowly, and often. And that puts you in the alpha state, a meditative state, and that's where supposedly you get the presence of God. This is, we're getting into the emerging church now. How many have heard of the emerging church? Okay, this is a major individual, a major leader in the emerging church named Tony Jones, and he wrote a book called The Sacred Way. Now, this book is used as a handbook for many people in the U.S. under age 35, people in the emerging church. And he says the basic method promoted in the cloud, that's the cloud of unknowing, is to move beyond thinking into a place of utter stillness with the Lord. And by utter stillness, it's not external stillness. Now, we've had external stillness here, but that's not the same as mental stillness where you put yourself in a trance. And he says the believer must first achieve a state of silence and contemplation, and then God works in the believer's heart. And we're going to look at, well, does God really work in the believer's heart, right? We're going to see what exactly the fruit of this is. But anyhow, Tony Jones is very influential with people under age 30, 35 or so, the emerging church. Let me see, did I just skip one? Okay, he says, it is particularly difficult to describe this type of prayer in writing, as it is best taught in person. In general, however, centering prayer works like this. Choose a word, Jesus or Father, for example, as a focus for contemplative prayer. Repeat the word silently in your mind for a set amount of time, say 20 minutes. 20 minutes until your heart seems to be repeating the word by itself, just as naturally and involuntarily as breathing. Well, if you say anything for even like half a minute, it loses its meaning and becomes just a word, no matter what it is. The main thing about language is that it's used in conjunction with other words, and then it makes sense. But take any word and you say it, by the time you've said it maybe 15 times, it just becomes a sound. It no longer has an emotional or intellectual connection. Okay, this came from a group called the Desert Fathers. You will not find this type of prayer anywhere in the Bible, either the Old or New Testament. This was invented by a group of monks called the Desert Fathers, and this can be documented. This isn't just my opinion. This is Episcopal, that means Anglican, pastor in Los Angeles, and he wrote a book called Finding God, and he says, it was a time of great experimentation with spiritual methods. Many different kinds of disciplines were tried. Many different methods of prayer were created and explored by them. So this is something that was made up, or not made up, but concocted by the Desert Fathers. They didn't really concoct it by themselves. They got it from, we'll see here, they got it from the following source. This is a book called The Dawn of the Mystical Age. The 4th century Desert Fathers understood that a simple device was needed to keep the monkey mind from wandering. Now, the term monkey mind is a Buddhist term, and it means your normal thinking. You're always thinking about something. And that in Buddhism is known as the monkey mind. Thus, the mantra method of prayer, which had been introduced centuries before by Buddhists and Hindus, came to be a stable form of Christian prayer, not only for the Desert Fathers and Mothers, but for Christians down through the ages. And by Christians, he meant monks, monks and nuns in monasteries, not your typical person, not your typical peasant, like I said. The reach of Christian mysticism. Okay, the first person to really popularize this was a man named Norman Vincent Peale. He had a very great reach in Christianity. He was friends with Billy Graham, and we'll see someone else here pretty soon that was very influential. And he wrote a book called The Power of Positive Thinking. And in The Power of Positive Thinking, you will find contemplative prayer. It says, throw your mind into neutral. When you have attained a quiescent state, then begin to listen for the deeper sounds of harmony and beauty of God that are to be found in the essence of silence. So in other words, all the millions of people that read that book were being told to throw your mind into neutral. And that's basically what contemplative prayer is. So one of his proteges was Dr. Robert Schuller. And Schuller wrote a book called My Soul's Adventure with God, in which he says the following. Now, he got this from Norman Vincent Peale, and Schuller said, find yourself coming alive in the garden of prayer called meditation. Yes, the New Agers have grabbed hold of meditation. Hey, Christian, hear me. Let's not give up the glorious God-given gift of meditation by turning it over to those outside our faith. Well, in essence, it's the other way around. What makes them New Agers is that they do meditation. So he's saying, well, yeah, the New Agers have meditation, but, they shouldn't, we should take it back from them and claim it for God, because this is a God-given gift. Well, it's only God-given if you can prove it, if it's in the Bible, right? Not just because the Desert Fathers practice it doesn't mean that it's God-given. Okay, he says in this book, Discover Your Possibilities, in a matter of seconds, I can get myself in such a state of relaxation where I am not at all conscious of my body weight, but sense that I am floating suspended in space. And this is when I go into two-way prayer. And that's the essence of contemplative prayer. It's not just, like I said, you don't just go into an altered state of consciousness and just stay there. You get a presence. You actually encounter supernatural forces. Now, let me explain the real disturbing aspect of this. Dr. Robert Schuller had a school for pastors for many decades, and literally tens of thousands of Christian pastors attended. I think it was called the School of Pastoral Counseling, or not counseling, but he would train people on how to grow their churches, how to have a successful church. And tens of thousands of pastors went to this church through, I think, since the 1970s. And he passed on this type of two-way, quote-unquote, two-way prayer, in his classes there. Okay, this is what I'm talking about. This is a place called the Shalem Institute for Spiritual Formation. And that is one of the buzzwords. There's a number of three different things that if you hear, you're dealing with contemplative prayer. One is spiritual formation, one is spiritual director, and one is spiritual disciplines. And this place trains spiritual directors to promote this to the general Christian public. And this gentleman right here, I believe, is Tilden Edwards, the person that founded it. And we have a variety of people sitting around there. And this is what the article, this is taken from a national news magazine in the U.S. Silence, appropriate body posture, and above all, did you get that? This is important. And above all, emptying the mind through repetition of prayer have been the practices of mystics in all the great world religions. And they form the basis of which most modern spiritual directors guide those who want to draw closer to God. Notice it doesn't say some, it doesn't say many, it says most modern spiritual directors. Tilden Edwards' explanation. We need to humbly accept the learnings, that's his word, of particular Eastern religions. What makes a particular practice Christian is not its source, but its intent. Selective attention to Eastern spiritual practices can be of great assistance to a fully embodied Christian life. So in other words, Eastern mystical practices can actually enhance your Christianity. Okay, this is the logo of an organization called Spiritual Directors International. And that's made up of people who have been trained to teach contemplative prayer. And they have 10,000 members. There are 10,000 people within Christianity who are teaching contemplative prayer to people within the various churches. This is what Alice Bailey talked about, the regeneration of the churches. This is not an obscure thing. This is not a tiny fraction of activity. This is, 10,000 people are doing this. And as you can see, there's this logo, and there's this ball, there's this round thing. It looks like a ball of light or an energy there, and there's this woman there, and she's saying, "Take me, take me." And this is their magazine, Presence. When you do this, you get the presence. Okay, SDI courses and classes. Okay. Now, keep in mind, this is supposed to give you a deeper experience of God. Now, would the God of the Bible have these kind of subjects? Okay, spiritual practice in various faith traditions, building a bridge to Buddhism. Now, the real God of the Bible would have you convert Buddhists, right? Would evangelize Buddhists, but this is building a bridge to Buddhism. Okay, Ignatian exercises and ecology, cosmology, the Enneagram and Kabbalah, the Sacred Labyrinth, a new spiritual paradigm, Earth Prayer, celebrating the interconnection of all living beings. And by that it means all living beings, earthworms, rattlesnakes, interconnection. Okay, and the last one, trans-faith spirituality. Remember I started out reading from the Anglican Bishop of Vancouver? That's what he's talking about here, trans-faith. In other words, spirituality that extends across, the entire religious spectrum. Okay, this is a woman named Ruth Haley Barton. She is with the Spiritual Directors International. And she is one of the U.S.'s leading spiritual directors. And she plays a very important role in what we're about to look at here. She has an organization called the Transforming Center. Now, how many of you have heard of Willow Creek Community Church? Oh, quite a few of you. She used to be the spiritual director for Willow Creek Church. And then she started her own group called the Transforming Center, and she talks about how she got into this. She said, a few years ago, this is an interview in a magazine, a few years ago I began to recognize an inner chaos in my soul. I sought out a spiritual director, someone well versed in the ways of the soul. The spiritual director said to me, what you need is stillness and silence. That's contemplative prayer. Our reliance on words, even in our praying, is often just another way we strive to maintain control. So if you just pray to God like we do here, you're just trying to maintain control. We open ourselves, you talk about if we open ourselves to what God wants to give. Prayer without words is not so much about expressing our dependence on God, but rather experiencing it. And by prayer without words, she means normal praying, or the type of praying the average Christian does. They use a word, but I'll show you how. Ask for a simple, that's the term. If you hear the word simple prayer, you're probably dealing with this. Ask for a simple prayer to express your willingness to meet God in the silence. A simple statement such as, here I am. Help yourself return to your original intent by repeating the prayer that you have chosen. This is, done for 20 minutes. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if someone called you on your cell phone and you answered and they said, here I am, 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 here I am. I mean, wouldn't you hang up on them? Isn't that vain repetition? Is that talking to you? Well, I wouldn't think so. It's not talking to you. Well, here's where it gets really, really profoundly important that you understand this. The Assemblies of God are the biggest Pentecostal denomination, I think, in the United States and perhaps the world. Well, Ruth Haley Barton is having a major impact on their leadership. They have 65 million people, 65 million. 3 million in the United States and 62 million in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Now, that is a large number of individuals, I would say. Well, anyhow, Ruth Haley Barton, contemplative prayer is her main focus. It's not a sideline, it's her specialty. And she was speaking at their main conference in Florida last year. So people such as, Lighthouse Trails, people that are in the discernment field, raised a protest, right? Well, this is what happened. The main superintendent had this Jody Dietrich is head of the chairperson for the Network for Women and Ministry in the Assemblies of God, and they said, people such as myself were, completely wrong. And this is what this Jody Dietrich said: countless AG, that means Assembly of God people, and credential leaders have testified of drawing closer to the Lord as a result of Ruth's books and teachings. It's really no wonder that the enemy would like to keep this message from being heard. He would prefer that Christian leaders remain too busy to stop their activity, wait on God, and hear from him. So do you see that it's kind of like a reverse thing here, that countless Assembly of God leaders draw closer to the Lord through doing this, here I am for 20 minutes. And then people that protest, they're the satanic ones, like somebody who's saying, no, this isn't of God. That's the enemy who's trying to keep you from hearing God directly. So it's like a total reversal. But 65 million human beings, 65 million people are being impacted here. Okay, Thomas Merton. He is probably the one of the most influential, the most prominent promoters of contemplative prayer there is. Before him, it was only found in monasteries and convents. What he did was take it out of that environment and spread it all over the Catholic world, and then into the mainline Protestant world, and now, as you can see, into the evangelical world. And when you look at his sayings and his books, you can understand the correlation with Eastern religion. Okay, he said in one of his books that it is you can see how this corresponds to Hinduism and Buddhism. He said, "It is a glorious destiny to be a member of the human race. Now I realize what we all are. If only they, human beings, people, could all see themselves as they really are, I suppose the big problem would be that we would fall down and worship each other." Well, why? Why would we want to fall down and worship each other? At the center of our being is a point of nothingness, which is untouched by sin and by illusions, a point of pure truth. This little point is the pure glory of God in us. It is in everybody. Now, this corresponds to the Buddha nature in Buddhism and the higher self, or the Atman, in Hinduism. So, basically, Thomas Merton, even though he was a Catholic, had embraced Eastern teaching through the practice of contemplative prayer. This is interesting. This is Michael Leach. He was the president of the Catholic Book Publishers Association. So this guy was not some fringe person. He was the president of the Catholic Book Publishers Association, and he let the cat out of the bag. He made it very apparent. This is not just my opinion. I could be making things up here. But he said, and this was in America Magazine. This is the official magazine. I think it's a Jesuit magazine, right? You're familiar with America Magazine? And he said, many people believe that the spiritual principles underlying the New Age movement will soon be reincorporated into the mainstream of Catholic belief. In fact, it's happening in the United States right now. This sheds new light on the spiritual truths about who we really are. And what he means by that is, we're God. We're God. And this was in America Magazine, the main Jesuit magazine in the United States. So he's saying that the spiritual principles behind the New Age movement are being reincorporated into the mainstream of Catholic belief. And you can see that with Thomas Merton. He said, the Sufis are the mystics of Islam. How many of you heard of the whirling dervishes? Yeah, I think they're in Turkey. You can go there and they wear these big hats, tall hats, and these big gowns, and they twirl around going Allah, Allah, and then their skirts fly up, and they go twirling around Allah, Allah. But anyhow, Thomas Merton said that I'm deeply impregnated with Sufism. In other words, he just didn't. This has nothing to do with just liking people as individuals. It has nothing to do with social interaction. This is spiritual. He was deeply impregnated with Sufism, and he was. He actually was. Okay. These contemplatives. This is from a book. This is crazy, folks. This is absolutely crazy. Setting the Gospel Free. Okay, Brian C. Taylor is another. It seems like the Episcopalians / Anglicans are major promoters of this. I mean, they seem to really be steeped in it. Brian C. Taylor, you can see his name there, is an Episcopal priest, and he says, these contemplatives also recognize their soulmates in other traditions, as did Thomas Merton in his pilgrimage to Buddhist Asia. This is because they have passed beyond the confines of religion as a closed system to an open awareness of God in life. So in other words, if you're a fundamentalist, you have this closed system. It's just closed. And once you break out of this, you see that God is in every other religious tradition, and it's your duty to unite with these other traditions, and you can bring world peace. You can have this universal religion that is going to, we'll get to that pretty soon here. Okay, this is again Brian C. Taylor. He said the God that he, Thomas Merton, knew in prayer was the same experience that Buddhists describe in their enlightenment. And Thomas Merton is one of the most, when you say Thomas Merton is one of the most influential Catholics that, okay. In fact, Vancouver School of Theology, you're familiar with, okay. Yeah, this is Vancouver School of Theology, where they train pastors for the Anglican Church and United Church of Canada. And they have a Thomas Merton reading room. Major stuff. We're not talking about cults. This is not about cults. And you can see Thomas Merton and you can see Buddha. Yeah, in other words, this is the old saying, one picture is worth 1,000 words. And I believe I've read that on Merton's grave, where he's buried, there is a Buddha. On it, or next to, or on his grave or whatever, a statue of Buddha. But he is like the patron saint of contemplative prayer. Virtually everybody, Ruth Haley Barton quotes him. The ones who's helped countless Assembly of God ministers. Okay, Richard Foster, Quaker. I've talked to him in person, and he told me. Well, I always jump the gun. I always get ahead. But I was told once that practically every pastor in North America had a copy of Richard Foster's book, Celebration of Discipline, in their study. Very popular, very influential. And Foster states, contemplative prayer creates a spiritual space which allows Christ to construct an inner sanctuary of the heart. It is a portable sanctuary that is brought to all we are and do. Now, I always thought that there already is a spiritual sanctuary in every Christian called the Holy Spirit, right? Yeah. You don't have to create one by saying a word over and over again. He says we should all, without shame, enroll in the school of contemplative prayer. I think enroll has 2 L's. Does it? Oh, that's right. Well, that's a typo in reverse. This is serious. I shouldn't be so humorous. But yeah, we should all enroll in the school of contemplative prayer. This is a lot of people in the evangelical church are starting to pick up on this. They're starting to believe that. Okay, I talked to Merton in November. Not Merton. I talked to Foster. Foster did a seminar at a Christian and Missionary Alliance church in my town there, and 650 people were there. I had to pay like $20 a piece or so. It wasn't free. And I got to talk to him afterwards, and he said that Thomas Merton tried to awaken God's people. Well, ladies and gentlemen, did Thomas Merton try to awaken God's people? I believe that he tried to take God's people away from the gospel, based on what you saw. I have numerous evidences that Thomas Merton was, not somebody who stood up for the gospel. Those are just enough to convince you. Okay, Henry Nouwen. How many have heard of Henry Nouwen? He's probably the second most popular. Merton is the first, and he would be like the second. And again, he was from very close to here. He was from Holland, the Netherlands, and he became a disciple of Merton. He became a follower of Merton. He was a Roman Catholic priest, and he started writing many books on the subject of contemplative prayer. And one of the strongest one was called The Way of the Heart. Now this book, you can see below here, Desert Spirituality and Contemplative Ministry. And this book is being used as a textbook by many groups like Young Life and Youth for Christ and things like that. This is being touted as a way to draw closer to God. And he says in this book, the quiet repetition of a single word can help us to descend with the mind into the heart. This way of simple prayer, again, that is a buzzword, simple prayer. If you hear somebody say simple prayer, watch out. This way of simple prayer opens us to God's active presence. So what we're seeing here is that just by being a Christian, just by believing the gospel, just by being born again and having the Holy Spirit, that doesn't cut it. That's not good enough. You have to have a mechanism. You have to have a mechanism to get God's active presence. If you're just a Christian, you're not going to get anything. You're just going to sit around and, sing praises and hear sermons and read the Bible and things like that. But if you want God's active presence, you have to do this. But where did it leave Henry Nouwen? I mean, what theology did he embrace by doing this? Okay, this is from his book, Sabbatical Journey. And he says, today I personally believe that while Jesus came to open the door to God's house, all human beings can walk through that door whether they know about Jesus or not. Today I see it as my call to help every person claim his or her own way to God. Whatever it is. Again, he was very inter-spiritual, interfaith. He would meditate with Buddhists, and he would say that his silence and their silence would meet and greet each other. Meet and greet each other. He also said, the God who dwells in our inner sanctuary is also the God who dwells in the inner sanctuary of each human being. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is New Age spirituality. Thomas Merton and Henry Nouwen were New Agers. This is New Age spirituality, that God, in the age of Aquarius, all humanity will realize that God dwells within, that everyone's true self is their divine self. This is how many have heard of Sue Monk Kidd? Oh, quite a few, huh? She is probably the greatest example of what I'm talking about. Sue Monk Kidd was a Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher in a small town in South Carolina. Now, South Carolina is the Bible Belt. The American South is called the Bible Belt. And I think she was even a missionary at one time. But she was married. She was a wife and mother, and, typical wife and mother. But a Southern Baptist, very conservative, or once conservative organization, and lived in a small town in South Carolina. And somebody gave her, in their Sunday school class, somebody gave her a book by who? Thomas Merton. So this is what happened. She read it and started doing it, and she put out this book here in the 80s called God's Joyful Surprise. And she said, I found a host of Christian thinkers and saints talking about a way of being with God, a way of needing him and experiencing him in the depths of one's being that opened the door to oneness with him. They called it contemplation. I was amazed to realize that I had known practically nothing about this ancient and powerful tradition of Christian meditation. I was ready. Well, I want to show you who endorsed this book. You may know the last one, but Virtue Magazine and Today's Christian Woman were the top Christian women's evangelical women's magazines in the United States, the top ones. Okay, the Virtue Magazine said it was their best book of the year. And it said, a joy to read from beginning to end. Okay, Today's Christian Woman said, the message and challenge of the book is profound. And probably most astounding, this is Moody Monthly, Moody Bible Institute, said, Kidd suggests some disciplines for cultivating some interior quietness, and a richer personal experience of God's love. A richer personal experience. Well, this is what happened. This is where it led her. A few years later, back in the early 90s, she came out with her third book called The Dance of the Dissident Daughter. And in it, she says, this is what happened. You know, she was doing contemplative prayer, and she says, the minister was preaching. He was holding up a Bible. It was open, perched atop his raised hand as if a blackbird had landed there. He was saying that the Bible was the sole and ultimate authority of the Christian's life. The sole and ultimate authority. I remember a feeling rising up from a place about 2 inches below my navel. It was a passionate, determined feeling, and it spread out from the core of me like a current so that my skin vibrated with it. If feelings could be translated into English, this feeling would have roughly been the word no. It was the purest inner knowing I had experienced. And it was shouting in me, no, no, no. The ultimate authority in my life is not the Bible. It is not confined between the covers of a book. It is not something written by men and frozen in time. It is not from a source outside myself. My ultimate authority is the divine voice in my own soul, period. Well, let that sink in for a while. Let that sink in. This was a total rejection of the Bible that was just flowing through her. She had become indwelled by a spirit that had that attitude toward the Bible. It gets worse. In the same book, we also need, it says a time of departing in there, but it was taken from Dance of the Dissident Daughter. We also need goddess consciousness to reveal earth's holiness. Matter becomes inspirited. It breathes divinity. Earth becomes alive and sacred. Goddess offers us the holiness of everything. Remember Merton, that we all knew who we really were. We'd fall down and worship each other. As I grounded myself in feminine spiritual experience that fall, I was initiated into my body in a deeper way. I came to know myself as an embodiment of goddess. Okay? She said, a mystical awakening in all the great religious traditions, including Christianity, involve arriving at an experience of unity or non-dualism. In other words, all is one. In Zen, that's mindfulness, it's known as samadhi. The day of my awakening was the day I saw and knew I saw all things in God and God in all things. So do you see what I'm getting at here this weekend? That, you know, in all these different areas, you got mindfulness meditation, which is, you know, Buddhist. You got yoga exploding. And you got Reiki exploding, all these energy healing techniques. And instead of stopping it, Christianity is actually absorbing an element of it. And as Alice Bailey predicted, actually becoming a catalyst for spreading this around. Sue Monk Kidd would have got the same thing had she went to a Zen monastery or a yoga studio or a Reiki healing center. And also, like I said, if there were just, you know, pockets of this, but the leadership of the Assemblies of God, 65 million people, are being totally swept up into this same type of practice. And as I've been told here, the Anglican Church here in Great Britain is also completely embracing this. Along with Thomas Merton, Richard Foster uses Sue Monk Kidd as an example of someone who practices contemplative prayer. In his book, Prayer, Finding the Heart's True Home, in the chapter on contemplative prayer. So Richard Foster uses Sue Monk Kidd and Thomas Merton as examples of contemplative prayer. You know, and to me that says a lot. What is the verdict on Christian mysticism and contemplative prayer? Well, okay, if they were really so close to God, they would understand and embrace the gospel to a degree that would be perfectly clear. But in reality, contemplative prayer has taken them in the opposite direction. Instead of being valiant stewards of the Great Commission, it has caused them to be immersed in spiritual adultery. In essence, what we've seen here at Sue Monk Kidd is spiritual adultery. Now we're going to look at a few of the major leaders who are promoting contemplative prayer. I talked about the emerging church, you know, earlier. This person is Brian McLaren is as the de facto leader of the emerging church, very highly touted, and Okay, this he endorsed, but we're going to see we're going to see where his spirituality really lies. Again, Alan Jones is an Episcopal. What's it called when you're head of a cathedral? Dean. Yeah, dean. That's it. Dean. He's head of the cathedral in San Francisco, Episcopal Cathedral in San Francisco, and he wrote a book called Reimagining Christianity. And again, one picture's worth 1,000 words. Here we have a cross dangling from the rearview mirror, and here we have a Buddha. That's a Buddha right there. And he writes, the life of contemplative prayer, loved and in communion with all things, the soul is born in and out of the secret silence of God. This silence at the heart of mysticism is not only the meeting point of the great traditions, that means religions, but also where all hearts might meet. And this is the connotation of the last days, the tribulation, that he's saying contemplative prayer, or what, the equivalent, is not where just the world's religions can meet, but where all of humanity can meet. And we know that this is the realm of familiar spirits. This is the realm of familiar spirits. And Brian McLaren on the back cover says, this reimagining Christianity is what's happening right now. It's being reimagined. It's being regenerated, as Alice Bailey said. It used to be that Christian institutions and systems of dogma sustain the spiritual life of Christians. Now that systems of dogma means the Bible, right? Systems of dogma. Increasingly, see that word there, increasingly, spirituality itself is what sustains everything else. And by spirituality, he means mysticism. Alan Jones is a pioneer in reimagining a Christian faith that emerges from authentic spirituality, which is mysticism. See, the way we believe, that's not authentic spirituality. That's just fundamentalism. That takes you away from the living God, as we saw at the beginning. His work stimulates and encourages me deeply. Okay, so we know where Brian McLaren stands. This is a book called The Mystic Heart by Wayne Teasdale, and the preface was written by another, I think she may be Roman Catholic, Dr. Beatrice Bruteau, and she says, nothing is more practical for realizing our desire for a better world than mysticism. See, people in the religious world are starting to see mysticism as something that's going to save humanity. It's going to save the planet. That, we have all these, there's these fundamentalists in all the world's religions, and they're the ones that fight, and want to have war. But if the mystics can, break out of that, and everybody can get in touch with their true self, then we can have this world of peace and tranquility. And this is what I've actually heard Wayne Teasdale in person. He's a very nice guy, a very nice person. He's not sinister at all. He's somebody you'd want to invite to dinner. He's very charming, very likable. And he says, third millennial spirituality will also be interspiritual and intermystical. Intermysticism is the realization that there is one universal tradition of the mystical life with its many branches. In other words, all the world's religions sprang from one universal tradition, and now that one universal tradition is going to flower, kind of rise up, and there's going to be a coming together of all the world's traditions back to the starting point. But see, in Christianity, this coming back is not based on the Bible. It's not based on worship of Jesus Christ or the gospel. It's based on the what Paul called the mystery of iniquity. So Swami Vivekananda, who was a Hindu guru, said, the Christian is not to become a Hindu or a Buddhist, nor a Hindu or a Buddhist to become a Christian, but each must assimilate the spirit of the others. In other words, Thomas Merton did not stop being a Catholic. He didn't bail out of the Catholic Church. He stayed a Catholic monk, but he absorbed the religious views, the spiritual views of the Buddhists, Hindus, and Sufis. But he never left. He never abandoned the Catholic Church. And that's what Swami Vivekananda was talking about, that everybody absorbs everybody else's spiritual views. But it's a one-way street, as I said earlier. The problem is that the Christians absorb the spirit of the Hindus and the Buddhists, but those in the Eastern religions do not absorb the Holy Spirit of God. It is a one-way street in favor of the Eastern mystics. And it couldn't, you couldn't have it that way and have authentic Christianity, absorbing the spirit. You're supposed to, evangelize people in other religions. You're supposed to evangelize them. You're supposed to, the Great Commission, right? The Great Commission. What we have here is a total rejection and abandonment of the Great Commission. Okay, here's another one, M. Scott Peck, The Road Less Traveled. Have you heard of this gentleman? Oh, you haven't. Well, anyhow, he was a very popular author in the States. He wrote this book called The Road Less Traveled, sold 8 million copies. 8 million copies. And this was, I mean, to sell 8 million copies of this type of book is astounding. Absolutely astounding, because this is like, this book would be boring to your average person. This is like a deep theological book. And it sold 8 million copies. And he was practiced contemplative prayer. He said, Peck states that contemplative prayer is a lifestyle dedicated to maximum awareness. But what kind of awareness is that, you know? Okay. I spent 20 years in Zen Buddhism, which prepared me for Christianity. Zen Buddhism should be taught in every 5th grade class in America. Okay, here's the worst one. This is the one that really gets me. Christianity's greatest sin is to think that other religions are not saved. Well, the thing is, you know, Buddha didn't die for anyone's sins. You know, Lao Tzu didn't die for anyone's sins. And that's why we think that other religions are not saved, because, you know, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes unto the Father except through me. It's as simple as that. It's the preaching of the cross that's being attacked here. Okay, here's another one, Marcus Borg. That's a Norwegian name. Marcus Borg grew up in a Lutheran family in North Dakota, you know, in the Midwestern U.S. A lot of people from Scandinavia settled there, either Germans or Scandinavians. And he grew up, and he became a professor and started doing contemplative prayer and became a major advocate. He's written like 30 books, I think. He's very popular with, Gareth, he's very popular with United Pastors in Canada. I've talked to United Pastors, and they think he's the bomb, you know. That's a slang term which means really great. And he says contemplation typically involves the silent repetition of a mantra, whether a single word, a short phrase, or a series of short phrases. And that's contemplative prayer. And notice that the name of his book is The Heart of Christianity. Okay, get ready to have your mind blown. Are you ready? Are you ready to have your mind blown? Okay. Well, we're going to look at another portion of the Heart of Christianity. He says that Jesus is the only Son of God, born of a virgin, that he died for our sins, that he rose physically from the dead, that he will come again, and so forth. This image of Jesus no longer works for millions of people, both within and outside the church. It no longer works. For these millions, its literalism and exclusivity are not only unpersuasive, but a barrier to being a Christian. Let me show you again, okay? That Jesus is the only Son of God, born of a virgin, that he died for our sins, that he rose physically from the dead, that he will come again, is now considered a barrier to being a Christian. Well, the reason is it's a barrier to being a Aquarian Christian. It's a barrier to being a contemplative Christian. You know? And that's where it leads. He does contemplate. I've seen him in person. Another person I've seen live, and an Episcopal church in where I live, St. Paul's. How ironic is that? St. Paul's Episcopal Church, and there were hundreds of people there. And he actually said that he did contemplative prayer every morning. And I'm going to do a demonstration here. This is kind of, this really got me, but he said it made him mad when people said we should worship God. It got his blood pressure up. And then he did kind of a mocking gesture. He starts rubbing his body. He goes, oh, I just love it when they worship me. Yeah. And he starts rubbing. Oh, I just love it when they worship me. You know, kind of mocking that. He said it got his blood pressure up when people said we should worship God because, you know, we're God. You know, he calls what we believe immature religion. We're immature, and that We need a mature, that's what he says in the heart of Christianity. We need a mature religion where we realize that God is in everything and everybody, and this worshiping God as an individual, like a big person, that's childish. That's completely childish. Okay, contemplative prayer is an esoteric tradition, and it is. It's not something that has been found in Christianity except for, the monastic system. Jesus says, and when you pray, do not use vain repetitions, like, here I am, as the heathen do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Okay? Prayer is a personal relationship with God. I don't need to tell you what prayer is. I mean, you know what prayer is, right? You know what it is. Well, I would think so. I mean, prayer is talking to God, pouring your heart out to God, praying for others, And God does answer prayer, right? Amen? Amen. God does answer prayer. I've had numerous situations where I prayed and God answered. Numerous situations. God is a living force to me. God is a reality. And contemplative prayer is something that takes people away from the living God. Okay? Paul says, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. So once a person is saved, we're Jesus' workmanship, and he begins to work on us. You don't need an esoteric practice. You don't need an esoteric tradition. Nowhere in the Bible is there anything explaining that you need to say words or phrases over and over again for God to work on you. Paul says, for I have not shunned to declare to you the whole counsel of God. If this really was true, if contemplative prayer really was something that would advance the Christian life, wouldn't the Apostle Paul promote it? Wouldn't he mention it? Of course he would. There's no doubt. Now the Spirit expressly says that in the latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons. And also in the King James it says seducing spirits and doctrines of demons. Now, the word seducing means that they're not going to know they're being seduced. If you get seduced, it means you're being tricked, you're being fooled, right? You're being, you don't find out until it's too late that you've been seduced, until the damage has already been done. And doctrines of demons, well, ladies and gentlemen, the idea that every human being, if we knew who we really were, we'd fall down and worship each other, is a doctrine of demons. A doctrine of demons. 2 Thessalonians 2:3. Okay, this is really the message here. This isn't just some wacky phenomenon. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day, that's the day of the Lord, shall not come except there come a falling away first, and then... something's wrong here. Oh, there we go. Except there come a falling away first, and then the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition. So from my perspective, we're in the falling away right now. I mean, full blast, full bore. And I don't know when, but there's going to be a culmination. And I want people to go out and tell others about this. I want this information to get out. It's well documented. Doctrines of demons. Let's see if there's anything on. Well, I guess that's it. Okay, well, thank you very much.